The other thing, another rule of thumb, you can't assume, this happens to be a family in Bangladesh, you can't assume that people don't already have financial instruments. A lot of them are informal. And yes, you are competing with the informal market. A lot of the informal tools are better than the tools that you can offer. How do you slip in and offer something that the informal market does not offer to people? Also, don't assume that people haven't used the same type of tool that you're offering them. They might have used something that totally failed in the past. How do you regain their trust when they've said, but the last time I worked with an institution like you, it turned out to be a disaster? How do you build that trust again? So always, never assume that you're dealing with virgin territory. Always assume that you're dealing with a trash dump of financial services. How do you deal with the trash dump? You're not dealing with nice green land that has never been planted before. The poor are always stretching their income. And that's why they have their budget, but they can do things with that budget. They can work more. They might be able to stretch that out a little bit one way by working a little bit more or picking up a little business on the side, but then they have to stretch the other way. Their savings almost never come in handy when they have an emergency. There is almost never saving for a rainy day that doesn't have some sort of use in the portfolios of the poor. A lot of savings in the portfolios of the poor, but it's labeled, it's earmarked. Otherwise, you can't set it aside. There is almost never non-earmarked emergency savings. People use loans to do that. You might have a certain amount of credit. We noticed something odd, that people went to different little stores in their neighborhoods to buy their goods. And we said, why did you buy your bread from this guy last Wednesday, but yesterday you bought it from this guy? They say, well, you know, I've got credit at each of those 5 or 6 or 7 stores. And if I don't buy from them, I don't keep my credit alive. So there's a concept of shadow credit that low-income people have. They keep up their relationships. They keep up their networks. It almost reminds me of, you know, networking in the business world. You never know when somebody's going to become useful for you. So you keep buying at this shop or that shop or this shop because you never know when you're going to need credit from each one of those institutions. Inefficient, totally. Very useful, makes sense. Very logical if you just probe and ask and assume that people do it for a good reason. And then how much do you raise from your social network? Who do you call if you need school fees suddenly, you need some sort of money for propping up your house because it partially fell down? How do you do that? How do you tap into your social network, and how do you keep that social network alive? You didn't ask for money yet, but you're keeping it alive. People are very busy doing that type of thing, keeping that type of social credit alive. Another thing to realize, that 10 years ago, Esther Duflo wrote a paper about the economic lives of low-income people, and what flashed up really strongly was the amount of money people spent on festivals and dowries and funerals. In every single country, there is something where people spend a lot more than you would expect them to. Now, why is that? It's because at the end of the day, people do want to have lives. They want to leave something behind. If they don't spend on this type of thing, then what use is their life really? So I think the answer to that is not, oh my goodness, will you stop spending so much money on a funeral? That's crazy. It's, how do I make sure that you can plan properly for that funeral? How do I make sure that you can fulfill that obligation of your life? Because this is probably one of the most important lives in this person's being. It's what fulfills their life. when people buy homes, what does that mean? It doesn't mean often that they can leverage it into more credit because there isn't enough of a secondary market in the homes. What it means is I have arrived. I have dignity. I've done better than my brother. All sorts of stuff like that. I have shown my parents that I married the right man. I have become somebody. So homes mean a lot more than just a structure, and it's not like completely a financial decision. And so I often found when the woman who ran the bar, what did she spend all of her money on? All of her massive savings? They were going to buy a house way up country. And I thought, oh my goodness, what if a fire comes and wipes out your shack? Why don't you keep aside some savings just in case a fire comes? And she got a look of confusion on her face and said, if my shack burns down, people always come with wood and then help me rebuild it. I am really not worried about that. Oh, okay. What she's really worried about is if somebody comes along and takes away her liquor license. That's what she's worried about. Okay. Interesting. You have to get beneath the story, which always comes from assuming that people actually have a good reason for whatever they're doing. Being poor really means making trade-offs. So when you're putting your product into the market, we found if you're talking about sort of a dollar a day level, and this example comes from the Kenyan Financial Diaries. After you spend on your basic obligations, your food, paying for some sort of housing, paying for different things, you have about, out of $100, $33 left. Now on the screen you see an array of different things that people are trying to decide what they should do with that remaining $33. If you did all of them, you would need $71. You can't do all of them. You have to make choices. There's enormous and constant prioritization that is going on in the minds of low-income people all the time. If you're going to put your product into that mix, you need to realize that, again, you're not dealing with virgin territory. You're dealing with a set of choices, and you need to float to the priority. If you're selling insurance in particular, it's hard to float to that top of the list. If you're selling a savings product, you need to connect to something important in somebody's life so that it will float to the top of the list. Just saving is not enough. There are too many competing things. And then the last point, there is always chaos and uncertainty. There are fires. Something is always happening. Some sort of little event to jockey around. People don't know what's going to happen next. How do you sell a product into that chaos and uncertainty? What does that feel like? What do you have to tap into in order to make that sale? And lastly, success is possible. So this again is Numsa, the woman who owned the bar. And that little boy in her husband's arms, I almost guarantee you, is getting ready to go to university. This woman is able to do that. Now, she can't get herself out of that shack. She's probably always going to run a bar. Her husband's always going to be a gardener. But that little boy is going to university. So that next generation, she's managing to pull together all of her wherewithal to make sure that the next generation is better than hers. You might not grow your existing clients out of poverty. That's really, 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 really hard to do. But you can make incremental changes that will make the next generation move further up the income curve and ultimately make a huge difference.